Hey everybody, Mrs. Lowe here. This is our second lesson of factoring by grouping. Probably one of two videos. Hopefully we get it in two. So first we're going to start with a review of factoring like we did in lesson one. The first thing you always do when you factor is you factor out the greatest common factor. So I'm going to look at the three terms and I figure out the largest number that divides into them, and that is 8. And the number of variables that they share one m and they share one n. So the greatest common factor is 8mn. I'm going to divide each one of those terms by 8mn, and I'm going to write what's left over in the parentheses. So 40 divided by 8 is 5, m squared minus mn minus 2. Now, if I multiply the 8mn by all of these back, I should get this again, and that is indeed factored. Don't forget to write the greatest common factor on the outside and then what is left over on the inside. If there are 3 terms here, there must be 3 terms here once you factor out the greatest common factor. Notice that this is the greatest common factor here, GCF, and this is the remaining factor, which happens to be a trinomial because it has 3 separate terms. And that's going to be important because you're going to have to later try to factor this. All right, so that was a review of greatest common factor. So once you factor out a GCF, you look at the number of terms of the other factor. So in this case, the other factor has 3 terms. But today we're going to be looking to see if it has 4 terms. We're going to try to factor it by grouping. So this one has 3. We will talk about how to try to factor this. I know it's not factorable. So let's do one where it has 4 terms left over. So we're going to factor by grouping. Remember, the first step is always to factor out the GCF. So I know that all 3 of these terms are divisible by 3 only. So I've pulled out a 3 and I've written what's left over, which you see here in brackets. So now notice that this factor which is left over has 4 terms. I am going to group the first 2 together, and I'm going to pull out the greatest common factor of the first 2. And that's x squared. And I'm left with x plus 1. Then I'm going to group the second 2 together. I'm going to pull out the greatest common factor of those. Whatever sign you see here is what comes down. So this is a plus. Greatest common factor of these 2 is a 4. And I'm left with x plus 1. So what you should notice is that the green and the red both have the green and the blue both have a common factor. Remember, x squared is a factor and x plus 1 is a factor. 4 is a factor and x plus 1 is a factor. So notice that they both have an x plus 1. So I factor out the x plus 1, and when I factor that out, I'm left with x squared plus 4. So bring down the common factor of 3 as well. So here it is, completely factored. So once you factor out the GCF, if the polynomial is factored, then they have a common factor, x plus 1. Write the polynomial as a product of its factors, and don't forget the GCF. So let's do 2, and you can always check by multiplying it back out. So no GCF for example 2. I'm going to group the first 2 together, and notice I'm using 2 colors. This tends to help people. The greatest common factor of those 2 terms is w squared. I'm left with 3w minus 1. Whatever sign I see next is going to come down because that's what I'm going to factor out, a positive or negative. These 2 do not have a common factor besides 1, so I still want to write 1 as the common factor, and I have 3w minus 1. Notice 3w minus 1, 3w minus 1. If these were different, it's either not factorable or I've made a mistake. These are supposed to be the same. And because they're the same, you can factor it out to 3w minus 1. And then the remaining factor would be w squared plus 1. So you're pulling out a 3w minus 1. When you pull that out, you're left with w squared plus 1 for the second one. And there it is, factored. Let's try example 3. I group the first 2 together. For all of the ones we're doing, the order is it won't matter and you're always going to be able to factor, but sometimes you have to rearrange the terms so that it does work, but yours are always going to work. So I pulled out the GCF of the first two, and I'm left with x minus 3. So notice I'm going to pull out a negative here. That's going to switch this sign to a negative. The greatest common factor of these two terms is 16. I'm pulling out a negative 16, so I'm left with x minus 3. And that makes sense. A negative times a negative is a positive. And notice that these two factors are the same. So I factor out an x minus 3, and I'm left with x squared minus 16. Now, in this case, you don't need to know this yet, but this is a special case right here. It's a special binomial, and this will be less than 4. And this does factor to x minus 4, x plus 4. So sometimes you're not done, but just so you know, that's a special case. You guys are only going to have to worry about doing the two factors. So there it is, completely factored. So what I want you to do is I want you to read A and B and try to identify and correct the common mistakes. And then I'm going to go through the checked ones you see, 2, 3, 7, 11, and 13 in the next video. Okay, hope that helps.